Hi, my name is Mike Snow, and I wanted to talk about this book, Bury the Chains by Adam Hochschild. This is a fantastic book, and I loved every second of it. It tells the story of the abolition movement in the 17 and early 1800s in Great Britain. It's a fascinating story, and it should be required reading for anybody who is learning about the history of the modern world, for every school child. And we did learn about this in our school, which is pretty sad, but everyone should know about it. It's sobering to realize that for thousands of years of human history, most people have been under some sort of forced labor, some sort of coercion was involved, whether it was outright chattel slavery or whether it was some sort of serfdom. Coercion and force were almost always used to get people to go to work. And just a few hundred years ago, over roughly a century or so of campaigning and writing and moral development, people got rid of the slave trade and slavery throughout the world. It's an absolutely fascinating story, and it's really exciting. The story begins with the non-conforming religious movements in the 1700s in Great Britain, the ones that didn't join the Church of England, like the Methodists, and especially the Quakers, who took a powerful moral stand against slavery. It's fascinating that these people were able to come together, demand something of their government, and change the world. Slavery was ubiquitous at that time and had been throughout all of human history, and the fact that they were going to be able to get rid of it when it was considered an essential part of civilization, even democratic civilizations in the ancient world, was amazing, nothing short of remarkable. The story begins by talking about how the Middle Passage was run and how slaves were taken and how they were treated, and these very visceral, powerful descriptions of the slave trade and slavery form a cornerstone of the book that really make you realize how horrendous these conditions were and how clearly horrendous they are and how we would never stand for them today if we saw them. But back in those days, people were apparently more comfortable around them. But that is the fascinating moral process that the book talks about and doesn't really have any answers for. Why did people suddenly start caring about the horrendous suffering of their fellow human beings? Why did they start caring about people of a different skin color, spoke a different language in another country thousands of miles away, that were making them millions and millions of dollars, or pounds I should say, in revenue because of their slavery, because of their toiling? Why did they suddenly start caring? We don't really know, and the book doesn't know. The slave trade at the time was one of the richest trades to be in Europe. It made so much money that it created an entire class of nouveau riche people. It fed the French government an enormous sum of money. It made everyone in Britain and France who was involved in the trade extremely wealthy, if they were lucky enough not to die along the way. It's a fascinating world that they talk about in the late 18th century, and I really love how he sets the stage there in Britain and in the world. You really get a feel of being on the streets in these towns during the abolitionist days, when there were roving gangs trying to impress people in the Navy, and there were black people who were in danger of being beaten or killed or dragged off away from London back to slavery. It starts out by talking about the organization. It goes through all of the fascinating characters and their powerful moral convictions about getting rid of the slavery and the slave trade. And these characters are really interesting people because most of them were profoundly religious. Not all of them. A couple of them were more deists, but the great majority of them and the great majority of the people who started the movement in the early 1700s were extremely religious people, like the Quakers or the evangelicals. It's interesting to note that during the Enlightenment, this great moment where we shed the chains of religion and lack of freedom of thought of previous centuries and moved into the modern world, that the greatest moral triumph, the greatest thing that was ever done during that time, was not by the Enlightenment figures like Diderot and Rousseau and so forth. It was about extremely religious people, not the deists who were the founding fathers of our country or something like that. It was the people who were extremely passionately, devoutly religious and focused on their Christian morality that brought about an end to the slave trade. The opinion in Great Britain was completely in favor of the slave trade at the beginning of the book and totally opposed to it by the end. It's remarkable that they were able to change so many minds and change so many attitudes. If you suggested that you should end the slave trade, and some of the Quakers did in the early 1700s, you would have been laughed at as being ridiculous. It was totally unthinkable that you could be against the slave trade. But there were some people who were powerful, passionate, and spent their entire lives struggling in favor of abandoning the slave trade. And eventually, after decades of struggle and a fascinating journey, they did get rid of the slave trade, which is enormous inspiration for anyone who's trying to fight for social change and goes through an entire life and never gets anything done. Because some of the people in this book die before slavery is abolished, die before the slave trade is abolished. They take their entire lives and dedicate it towards this and just spread the message, spread the word, and do something that is very, very difficult. Try to get people to care. It's very hard. It seems impossible that they could have gotten rid of the slave trade. It seems ridiculous. Even if you sympathize with it at the time, you might have said, well, that would be nice, but the enemy is too powerful. We could never fight City Hall. We can never defeat them. But the abolition of the slave trade was one of those fundamental moments of democracy where people stood up. And back in the 18th century, most people couldn't vote, even in the most democratic country in the world, Great Britain. They could not stand up and say that, and make their voices heard, but they did anyway. They did through petitions, they did through lectures, they did through books and pamphlets and everything around democracy that makes freedom of speech so wonderful. They used to spread the word, and eventually popular opinion swayed against slavery, and it was eventually abandoned, although it took decades to achieve that. The book is never short of excitement, and it never repeats itself. It never gets bogged down on one subject or another. It goes back and forth between the French colonies and the British colonies about the life of the slave, about the horrors of taking slaves in Africa, about the general drudgery and violence in the life of the average white sailor at the time. It goes through an entire chapter about the Haitian slave rebellion and about slaves that actually took it upon themselves to make their freedom and not receive their freedom from Brits overseas. It talks about the black Africans who were prominent in the anti-slavery movement in Britain, as you might imagine. They would be very interested in that, and fought passionately and wrote many interesting tracts, including one by Olaudah Equiano, the famous abolitionist who was taken from Africa, or maybe was, we don't really know, he was taken from Africa, or maybe he was born in America, we don't know, but he was a slave who eventually earned his freedom and wrote about his experience and campaigned against slavery. It goes into great detail about what the slave plantations back then were like, which is fascinating to me, and how hellish they were, and the heat and the smoke of the boiling houses, the backbreaking labor, the brutality visited upon women regularly by brutish male overseers. It's absolutely exciting and terrifying. At its heart, this story is about a group of people who had a moral conviction, and everything was standing in their way. Everything from the government, from the military, to the chambers of commerce, to every facet in society, including general public apathy, was standing in their way, was fighting against them. They were a tiny, tiny minority of people when it started out with the Quaker movement in the early 1700s. And after decades of campaigning over multiple lifetimes, fighting fight after fight after fight, winning some, losing more, they eventually managed to persuade the British government to do the impossible, to change something that would have seemed inconceivable decades before and make the world a better place. For people who say, this is a huge story of inspiration for people who say that, well, you can't get rid of poverty or you can't get rid of war because poverty and war have always existed, and they've existed for thousands of years, and because of that, because history has them always there somewhere, you can't get rid of them. And that's BS, because you can get rid of them, because slavery was a cornerstone of human civilization for thousands of years. Even before civilization, in primitive times, there was always some sort of forced labor, capturing others, ordering them under pain of death or severe violence to work for you. And every society in some way did that. And they changed it. It took a hell of a lot of work and a hell of a lot of maybe sometimes zealous moral conviction against the slave trade and slavery. But they did it. They changed the world in a way that seemed fundamentally impossible before that. And that's absolutely amazing and should be an inspiration for everyone who reads this. I'm a bit ashamed that we did not cover this in my school during high school. We didn't read about this. We read about Harriet Tubman and some American abolitionists in the 1840s and 50s before the Civil War, but we didn't read about this. We didn't learn about the British abolition of the slave trade, and I'm outraged about that. We should have had this. This is much more important than the American abolitionists decades later, after the slave trade was already banned and after slavery was already outlawed in Britain itself by the time in the 1840s. It's fascinating that we didn't learn about this. Why not? This is so much more important than the American abolition. And I'm not saying the American abolitionist movement wasn't important. Of course it was important. But this is more important. And we should have learned about this first. And this was the start. This is where the American abolition movement started, in Britain. You know, we didn't come up with it ourselves. We didn't invent it. They began it in Britain. And we should have learned about this in school, and it's outrageous if there are kids out there not learning about this in school. If your kids are learning about European history in the past 500 years and they don't cover this in depth, in detail, that's outrageous, and you should do something to change that. And maybe give them this book, because it's easy to read, it's fun to read, it keeps you reading, it keeps you turning the pages, it doesn't shy away from the brutality and from the violence, including the really savage fighting between the British and French on one side and the Haitian rebels on the other in Haiti during the Haitian Revolution. It's absolutely great. It's gripping reading about this stuff. And it also goes into the role of women that played a big role in taking the anti-slavery movement to the next level in the early 1800s after the slave trade was banned. And it doesn't make any... It's important that this book is not somehow entirely a feel-good book to the point where it disregards reality. It mentions that the lives of black people did not receive much of an appreciable material improvement right after slavery, and they suffered after slavery too, and continued to suffer for decades afterwards. It's not like it shies away from that reality. It mentions that, and it's very, very important. This is a great book. It's exciting. It's a fantastic read. I've read it several times now, and I highly recommend it. Bury the Chains by Adam Hochschild.